On episode 365 of the 40 Plus Fitness podcast, we meet Tamara Freuman and discuss her book, The Bloated Belly Whisperer: See Results Within a Week and Tame Digestive Distress Once and for All. You can find the full show notes for this episode at 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/365. Have you decided you're ready to make a change? To reclaim your health and fitness? The 40 Plus Fitness Podcast is here for you. I'm your host, Alan Meisner. I'm an NSAM certified personal trainer with a specialization in corrective exercise and fitness nutrition. Let me be your coach as you find your way on your health and fitness journey. All right, let's go. Our guest today is a nationally known expert in digestive health and medical nutrition therapy for gastrointestinal diseases. Her name is Tamara Freuman. Tamara, welcome to 40 Plus Fitness.
Thank you.
So your book is called The Bloated Belly Whisperer. And I know from reading the book, why you kind of now have that, I guess for lack of a better word, nickname, but that's also now what you've called your book. Can you kind of give us a little bit of the backstory on that?
Sure. So I'm a dietitian and I work in a gastroenterologist's office in New York City. And pretty much from day one, when I started working there, patient after patient would come to me complaining of bloating. And early in my career, I really had no idea what this thing was. It's not something you read about in your textbooks when you're learning in dietitian school. And so I just had to ask a ton of questions and understand what was going on. And it became very clear to me very quickly that not all of these people were talking about the same experience or the same problem. And as my practice progressed and as my career progressed, I really kind of understood that bloating really meant many different things, but there was about 10 causes that I just kept seeing over and over again. And they started to look very familiar. And then it got to a point where within like the first 10 minutes of talking to someone who is bloated, by asking certain questions and gathering certain informations, there were clues that would really lead me very quickly to the right cause and therefore the right treatment. And it just, once I figured out how to figure it out, I was like, I better put this down in writing so that other people can really benefit from this knowledge.
And that's what I think is really cool. And having written my own book, I think, as a writer, you're going through and you're like, oh gosh, I really do hope they read this first chapter, because this first chapter is really critical. And I know so many people are going to flip there and say, well, I have constipation, so I'm just going to flip to that chapter and get to the rub of what I need to do. But you start off the book with a quiz. And the reason I like the quiz is it's looking for those other signs that someone might be missing because they have the most significant symptom in mind, versus they might actually have two of these things going on at the same time. And the quiz is actually going to help them do that. Can you tell us a little bit about, because you just kind of defined how you started developing this quiz, but can you tell us about the quiz, how it works, and why it's valuable for the reader to take some time to go through it?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I developed this quiz is because the way that it works when a patient comes into my office is I have an hour to sit with you and ask you a million questions. And I do. I ask everything, and then you'll answer something, and that will lead me to another question. And there's sort of this brain algorithm thing going on that leads me into this choose your own adventure decision tree. And then I kind of land at the answer. I can't do that in a written book. So what I had to do is come up with the next best thing. And this quiz really is how do I distill that very complex diagnostic back and forth into something that you can take by yourself at home and that will lead you to, if not the most, accurate answer, the top three. And then maybe you can pick from like the top two or three things that you sound like and recognize your own experience. And so the quiz is the best chance that I have to approximate an in-person patient consultation with a reader sitting in their own home.
And I really enjoyed going through the quiz and looking at the questions, and then the potential of where I would have answered at certain times in my life. I have the great fortune right now. I'm very clean with what I eat, so I don't tend to suffer from bloating much. But I can say, in my past, I definitely have had multiple symptoms of bloating and constipation and those types of things. So I recognize the nature of it. And so it was really cool to kind of go through and say, yeah, that's what I felt. That's how that was. That would have been my diagnosis at that point in time. So I do want to kind of go through what I think are some of the more common ones that I hear from friends and family and sometimes from clients. And the first one that got my attention, and I have a couple questions as we dive into it, is indigestion.
Yes.
Because
So
I see commercial after commercial after commercial of take this pill, take that pill. This is quick, that's going to take forever, but that lasts forever, and the back and forth. Can you kind of talk about the symptoms someone would have, and then what some of the treatments are that they can do?
Sure. So, I mean, indigestion, or the way I talk about it in the book, is the sour stomach bloat. And that's really sort of any kind of acid related malady. And this is one of the more common types of bloating that originate in the stomach. And one thing I try to do in the book is really separate bloating that originates in the stomach, which is its own beast and has its own remedies, versus bloating that originates in the intestines, which has other causes and other remedies. And so, of the types of bloating that originate in the stomach, indigestion, acid related issues are a problem. And what's tricky about them is they can be very situational. And patients have a really hard time identifying what's going on and whether they're food triggers, because they'll say, sometimes I eat this food and I'm fine. And then another time I eat that food and I'm miserable. Am I intolerant to that food or not? What's going on? And the issue is our stomach's reaction to food is very contextual. It depends when we last ate. Has it been 5, 6, 7 hours since we last ate and we are empty and acid? Or did we just eat, 3 hours ago, a big giant fatty meal and we're kind of still a little bit full from that meal? You could eat the same food in either of those contexts and have a really, really different reaction versus, you're on a normal meal schedule. It's been about 4 hours since you've eaten. You're a little bit hungry, not over full. You eat that meal and you have a third reaction. And so this idea that your body can overreact with acid, or you could have sort of a loss of pressure in that muscle that separates your stomach and your esophagus because you ate a lot of fat or you had some alcohol with the meal, and then that meal is refluxing on you. And so the trick to classic indigestion is really understanding the foods that trigger it, the contextual triggers of it in terms of your hunger level or fullness level, and therefore how to manage it with food choices, with supplements, with medications.
Okay, and I like how in the book you're very clear with let's start with the how and what we eat. So you kind of went through a process of saying, if you suffer from indigestion, you're going to want to eat more regularly, smaller meals, and do
Yeah.
those kind of things. And then if that doesn't quite solve all the problems, then there are some medical things we can do as far as over the counter and prescription stuff. Can you kind of walk through the food choices, the size and timing of meals, and then some of the other treatments?
Yeah, definitely. So as a dietitian, the way that I would typically approach people with, acid indigestion is I'm looking for foods that empty the stomach rather expeditiously, because the way I describe it is your stomach is basically a food blender. Its only job is to liquefy your meal. So not its only job, but its main job, liquefy the meal so that that liquid meal can trickle out of the stomach and move on into the digestive journey. And so I tell my patients, envision how much stomach acid does your stomach need to secrete, and how much time and churning does your stomach blender have to churn in order to liquefy a giant kale salad versus to liquefy a kale smoothie, right? Same
Yeah.
food, same ingredients, very different physical properties. And so you can envision what type of work and what kind of time and what level of acid will be required to liquefy certain textures of foods, certain volumes of foods, as compared to others. And so the first thing that I'm really looking at with my patients is how much volume do we eat in a sitting and what are the physical properties of that meal? And can we tame the texture? Can we tame the volume? Break it up instead of having, a big lunch at 12 and then nothing again till dinner at 7. Can we have a small lunch at 12 and then sort of the second part of your lunch at 3:30 or 4, and then another, small meal at 7, so that you're never too hungry and overeating, and then never too empty and starving, so that you're gonna overeat because you're starving. And so that's one thing that I do. And then the second thing as a dietitian that I care about is fat, because fat really does have an effect on the the sphincter muscle that keeps your stomach contents in the stomach and prevents them from refluxing into the esophagus. And really, really high fat meals can relax that pressure. And so that food is more likely to reflux. So for a patient who does have sort of that classic indigestion, I'm looking at fat, I'm looking at frequency of meals, I'm looking at volume of meals, I'm looking at texture. And for many, many patients, that gets them really far in terms of symptom control, even without any medications.
Yeah. And then you also threw alcohol in there because that can be symptomatic as well, right?
Absolutely. Alcohol has a very similar effect as fat in terms of relaxing that muscle, and that can make reflux more likely.
Okay. Now, most of the medications that are on the market, they actually reduce the stomach acid at some level. But I've read, and maybe it's just wrong, and I'm misreading something here, that sometimes we would have some of these symptoms because our stomach's not producing enough acid.
Yeah, that's a really common internet misconception that's out there. And so I know that there's a lot of beliefs that, not having enough stomach acid and we should take apple cider vinegar or other things to acidify the stomach or even supplements. There's one called betaine HCl that I see people use a lot. There's really no evidence to support any of this. And in fact, there is some pretty strong evidence to support the contrary. And frankly, if you ask any person who has suffered from chronic acid indigestion or more serious sort of chronic acid reflux disease, they feel better when they take a Tums, right? They feel
Yeah.
better with acid reducers. And so, I haven't really seen any evidence to support this idea that not enough stomach acid would cause acid indigestion.
Okay. Well, thank you for that because, like I said, that kind of confused me when I was reading through. Is like I thought we were supposed to go away from the Tums and go towards taking HCl to kind of push our stomachs to do the digestion faster, if you will. But I guess no. Thank you. So the
Sure.
next one I want to talk about, which I think is also very, very common, and actually very, very uncomfortable for a lot of folks because it makes it sometimes difficult for them to feel comfortable leaving the house, is constipation.
Yes. Constipation is a big one. It's really common. And also, I think a lot of people who are constipated don't recognize that they're constipated. And so I have a lot of patients who will come to me and they're complaining of bloating. And, when I kind of go through my little back and forth algorithm in my brain, it sounds very much like what I call backed up bloating or kind of being full of stool. And they'll say, oh, no, 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 I'm not constipated. I go to the bathroom every day. And there's this idea that if you move your bowels every day, you couldn't possibly be constipated. And that's not true at all. You could move your bowels, but move them incompletely, and still move your bowels every day and wind up having a very high stool burden or kind of a very large backlog of stool hanging out in your colon that's unable to really be passed. And so sometimes people can be constipated and they don't even know it.
Okay, so how would someone know the difference between normal constipation and something where they're just not completely getting rid of all the poo?
Sort of the classic constipation, what most people recognize as constipation is I don't go every day. I might skip a day, I might skip 2 days. My stools are really hard. They're these hard little balls, or I have to strain incredibly much to go. And when I go, I feel like I didn't get it all out. So that's sort of the typical experience of constipation that most people who have that will recognize that they're constipated. But there could be people who have extremely high fiber diets, for example, and they're putting a lot of stuff into the pipeline, and then they go to the bathroom once a day, and it's sort of like a smallish to medium sort of formed normal size stool. In other words, putting more stuff in than is coming out. Right? Someone on a really really high fiber diet might need to go to the bathroom 3 or 4 times a day to really kind of keep up with the input. And sometimes, if you're just going one time a day with a very high fiber diet and it's not an incredibly large amount of stool, like you might be falling behind, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's something that people might not recognize is going on. And then they don't understand why they're so bloated.
And that's because the fiber's picking up extra water and kind of making up some girth to what you're digesting versus not.
Right. So, I mean, fiber by definition is indigestible. So, fiber that goes in must come out. We cannot break it down. We cannot absorb it. And so, with fiber, what goes in must come out. And if a lot's going in and not a lot's coming out, then you might be outpacing your ability to eliminate it, which could happen for a variety of reasons. Maybe you have a little bit of slow colon, which that can happen. Maybe your pelvic floor muscles aren't particularly working optimally, and you're unable to pass large amounts of stool. There's lots of reasons that could happen.
Well, I actually had a green smoothie this morning. I mean, yesterday for my lunch, and I've already gone twice today. So I think the fiber is just working its way through me quite quickly.
It is. And I love that we're at the place in our relationship where we can share these things with each other. That's so great.
Well, it's funny because I'm actually there's another author that I'm interviewing, and he's pretty heavy into the fiber stuff, and I'm like, I'm gonna, even though I do the keto, I'm gonna work a little bit more on getting my greens in, and particularly the leafy greens with the fibers. So I did do a fruit smoothie yesterday. I'm gonna do a smoothie today, and see how that works for me.
Excellent.
All right, so someone comes to you and they are in fact constipated. So what can they do now to help themselves?
So the trick with constipation is it's really important to understand, if you can, the nature of the constipation. And so you can be constipated, but for more than one reason, as I alluded to before. For example, one thing is you just don't eat enough fiber. And that's sort of the low hanging fruit, someone who's not eating much, like nothing in, nothing out, right? And so that's sort of a more straightforward fix. Some people are constipated, like I said, because their colons are really, really slow. It just takes a really long time for stuff to move through them. And the longer waste spends in your colon, the more dried out it can become. And so that can be a cause for constipation. Some people, their motility is fine. Things move through them at a proper pace, at a normal pace, but their muscles, the muscles involved with defecation, aren't coordinating properly, and they can't relax and let the stool out, or their muscles are too weak and they can't propel, enough force to kind of get the stool out. And so there's all sorts of reasons that someone could be constipated. And typically, a dietitian or a doctor will start with some of the more likely causes. They'll look at the fiber. They might do like a little bit of an over-the-counter kind of laxative thing and see if that does the trick. And for many people with like a slow transit constipation or inadequate fiber, that is a really quick and easy fix. But if you're someone that is on a high fiber diet and you've taken, magnesium supplements or Miralax or, a Senna tea or something, sort of those low level laxatives, and literally they haven't done a thing for you, then we have to start wondering whether your musculature can really support healthy defecation, and maybe get an evaluation from a gastroenterologist of your pelvic floor function to see, because all the laxatives in the world and all the fiber in the world isn't going to help if there is sort of some faulty plumbing and things can't get out.
Okay. I typically I'll have some coffee in the morning, and that seems to be a stimulant that gets my whole digestive system working rather quickly.
Yes.
Now, so that is something that could also consider is some caffeine in the morning.
So it's actually not the caffeine. It's the
Okay.
coffee in coffee that
Oh,
works. And
okay.
there's
Okay.
a compound called chlorogenic acid, and it's in regular coffee and it's also in decaf coffee. And that is what stimulates the colon to kind of perk up and move along. And so you could get that benefit from both a regular coffee and a decaf coffee, whereas even a caffeinated tea will not have as strong of an effect because it doesn't have the chlorogenic acid. And so I know a lot of people, they don't drink coffee because they I'm caffeine sensitive. The caffeine doesn't agree with me, so I can't drink coffee, and therefore I can't benefit from the sort of gut stimulating properties of coffee. And I always tell them, oh my gosh, decaf works too. If you enjoy the taste of coffee and you're willing to have a decaf, get on that because it'll help.
Cool. Cool. Now, and yeah, that was in the book. I just actually forgot about it. I guess the other question that came up as I was reading through, because I had a guest on once that swore by coffee enemas, and I know enemas are a way to kind of help with constipation from time to time. But what are your thoughts on coffee enemas?
So, I mean, enemas in general will promote emptying. And so I've had patients who've needed to use enemas regularly because, their pelvic floor muscles don't work well, or because they have extremely sort of pathologically slow transit, and enemas sort of on a regular basis or the only way that they're really able to get some relief from their bloating. And so enemas, whether it's coffee or water or saline or whatever, My understanding for the few patients I've had that have done coffee enemas, it was really about an alternative delivery system of caffeine because they were not able to tolerate coffee by mouth. And so once I had a patient who had these terrible migraines, and caffeine really helped her with her migraines, but she couldn't drink coffee. It gave her this awful, awful acid reflux. And so she happened upon the solution of coffee enemas as a delivery system for caffeine, and that seemed to work for her. So my understanding of a coffee enema in terms of constipation relief, it probably has much more to do with the enema and probably a lot less to do with the coffee.
Okay. Okay. And any other thoughts as someone's going through constipation that they can do besides the changing and making sure they're getting plenty of fiber, maybe taking some of the soft laxative formulas or perhaps enemas that we could consider if we're looking for treatment options.
I mean, again, so what I would say about the fiber question is if you are someone who does have a pelvic floor function disorder, actually eating less fiber until your pelvic floor muscles have been rehabilitated through treatment might actually make it better, not worse. And so the fiber is a little bit tricky, which again kind of comes back to this idea of, if more fiber doesn't feel better, there may be a reason for that. And for some people, less fiber may be better. But there's another thing that is a little bit under-recognized with constipation, and that is position on the toilet. And so there's something out there called a squatty potty, which is basically an overpriced step stool that you put in front of your toilet. And it raises your knees so that when you're sitting in a toilet, you're in a more squatting position. And that is our body's more preferred natural position for pooping. And the pelvic floor muscles are sort of optimally aligned when we are in a squatting position. And particularly for people who have pelvic floor problems, getting those knees up with a step stool of some sort while you're going to the bathroom can really make a difference.
Yeah. And I should reiterate because I think a lot of people stop their squat real early. So just being seated is not necessarily the squat position. We're talking about your bottom being a little lower so that the hip crease is below your knees. And yes, the stools or the squatty potties, they put you into that natural position while you're on the toilet. So if you are having some issues, and that's actually why the guy invented squatty potty, is I think he said his mother was having some issues, and that's why he came up with it, which, is cool. But it is just a stool. And then I guess the last area I really want to kind of get into as far as some of the things that we would deal with that I see from time to time is carbohydrate intolerance. Can you get into that a little bit?
Sure. So carbohydrate intolerance is any time that you have digestive distress because of a poorly absorbed carbohydrate. And there's sort of these different families of carbohydrates that human beings may be inclined for one reason or another not to absorb very well. And I think the one that most people are familiar with is lactose intolerance, right? And so I think it's pretty common knowledge at this point that for a large segment of the population, once we're kind of out of our teenage years or out of our 20s, we start just producing less of the digestive enzyme lactase that we need to absorb milk sugar or lactose. And as a result, when we have too much dairy, especially high lactose dairy, we can get really gassy, we could get bloated, we can have diarrhea.
Yeah.
And so that's one that we're very familiar with. But there are other carbohydrates that we could also be intolerant to. Another one is fructose. And so there are these special transporters in our gut that are supposed to take fructose out of the gut. And some people have more of them than others. And so if you have a really high load of fructose and you don't have enough transporters to take it out of your gut, you're going to have very similar symptoms as lactose intolerance. And the trick to some of these carbohydrate intolerances is the symptoms don't onset immediately after the lactose or the fructose or the offending carbohydrate. It takes at least 4 hours and typically closer to 6 to 8 hours because the symptoms of malabsorption don't happen until that sugar or carbohydrate makes it all the way to your colon, and that takes a while. And so what can happen is someone might experience like sort of this onset of gas at like 3 p.m. and they'll look and be like, oh, what did I just eat? But really what they should be looking at is what did they eat for breakfast? And there are other carbohydrate intolerances that I'm seeing more and more of as well, especially with some of the special diets and the new products coming out that are sugar-free, low carb. There's a lot of use now of sugar alcohols, things like sorbitol, erythritol, xylitol. People like them a lot because they're natural or naturally derived. They have no calories. They don't raise your blood sugar. And so you're seeing them in a lot of sort of sugar-free, low carb, even some keto products. The problem is when you have a lot of them, in your diet, they can exert a very similar effect as a lactose intolerance or fructose intolerance because human beings don't absorb them well. And so those two can produce gas, bloating, diarrhea, things like that. And
Okay.
so there's just these different families of carbohydrates that can produce those symptoms.
And so that's just going to be sort of a function of doing a food log and kind of looking at symptoms and trying to find that connection.
Definitely. What I tell people is a food and symptom journal for like a week, 10 days, where you kind of record the time of what you eat, sort of everything, and the time of onset of symptoms. And what you're going to want to do is look back sort of at that 4 to 8 hours before your symptom onset, because very often that's where it originates. And that's especially so for carbohydrate intolerance, not necessarily for other types of bloating. But for carbohydrate intolerance, a food and symptom journal is terrific. It really provides the data you need to figure it out.
Okay. Now, in the book, you went through several supplements that we can use to kind of help our digestive system do the things it's intended to do, so we don't have these plumbing issues, for lack of a better word. Do you mind taking and going through a few of your favorites that I think would benefit most of us to consider having as a part of our diet?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if I think about, I'm not a big pill pusher. I'm not a huge supplement pusher. I'll
I'm not
start there.
either. I'm not either. But I just tell you, I get more questions about what supplements should I be taking, and
Definitely.
I tell them, I said, whole foods first, get whole foods
Definitely.
first, and then
So,
if there are some other issues and you want to optimize, then that's when you can start looking to these things.
absolutely. I mean, I'd have to say, if I had to pick the top two that I use, that I recommend the absolute most often, and the top two that give the most of my patients, like if I could only have two supplements to recommend for the rest of my life, like which two would they be? They would probably be magnesium and soluble fiber. And so starting with magnesium, it's an electrolyte, it's a mineral, our bodies have a need for it. So it's something that we need anyway. But when we take it in higher doses of 350 milligrams or more, it has what we call an osmotic laxative effect. And that's just a fancy way of saying it draws more water into the bowel and speeds up bowel transit, so that people who tend to be on the slower, more sluggish side, people who tend to have harder stools that are difficult to pass, it's magical for them. You take it at bedtime, usually in a dose of sort of 400 500 milligrams, sometimes a little bit higher if needed, and the next morning, it really helps regulate bowels for people who are constipated. And it's really safe, it's really cheap, it's really available, and so it's something that I recommend a lot. And it's just a lot of bang for your buck.
Yeah,
um,
I use a ZMA supplement from time to time, but I would caution folks with magnesium is walk your way into it, or you might wake up in the middle of the night and have a hurry go kind of situation. But I do use a ZMA occasionally, and the other thing I've noticed about the ZMA is it gives me these really cool lucid dreams from time to time. I just dream better, and I think probably I'm sleeping better with the ZMA. So it is also relaxing and helps you sleep.
Interesting. Okay, I don't have all that much experience with it, so it's really interesting to get that feedback. I would say that the other supplement that I use a lot is for people with the opposite problem, diarrhea. People who are really prone to diarrhea and kind of this pattern of running back and forth to the bathroom 4 or 5 times every morning, where they feel like they can't get out of the house. And for that, a soluble fiber supplement, sort of in the mass market, things like Citracel and Benefiber. In the more natural market, you're looking at things like acacia fiber, Heather's tummy fiber, things like that. Taking that in the evening at bedtime can really regulate the bowels in the morning, kind of calm down that spasmodic back and forth, consolidate all these kind of little pieces that aren't kind of coming out at once, and just consolidate them into one or two complete, calm, normal formed stools that you get out easily and you get on your way. And, I have to say that for my patients with sort of irritable bowel syndrome that are diarrhea prone and kind of spasmodic, soluble fiber is just magical for them. They do so well with it. And so I rely heavily on that in my practice.
Okay. I define wellness as being the healthiest, fittest, and happiest you can be. What are three strategies or tactics to get and stay well?
Oh, I love that definition of wellness. And I think it's so similar to my own. One thing I see that I think undermines a lot of people's ability to achieve that the definition that you've described is there's a real dogmatism about diet. we kind of adopt these dogmas that, this is bad, this is good, you should eat this way, or we all should eat that way. And because so and so told me that, and so eats that way. And there's sort of this black and white thinking as if all human beings have to eat the exact same diet. And I like to really encourage people to step back and kind of take a more global perspective, which is there are populations all over this big planet of ours who have extremely healthy lives that live into their hundreds without chronic disease, very, very well. And they eat really different diets. There's not one diet that all human beings have to eat, and one diet that works for you or for your personal trainer or for your aunt or for your best friend might wreak havoc on you in terms of digestively, or just might be miserable for you because it makes you gassy, or you hate the foods on it, or it's inconvenient for you. There's a lot of reasons why we don't all have to eat the same diet. And I think allowing yourself and opening yourself to the possibility that you could have a very healthy diet and I could have a really healthy diet and we could have completely different diets. And that is not a conflict, right? I think
No.
that's so important. And so that's the one thing, is to be a little bit less dogmatic about diet and really be open to the possibility of different paths to good health. I think that there's another thing that I see a lot that kind of really has a negative impact on people's relationship with food and eating, which I think impairs wellness, is sort of this real emphasis on, what to avoid, what to eliminate, what's toxic, what's bad, and sort of like placing foods into these categories of demons, like these are dietary demons, and defining your diet based on what you don't eat. And what I'll say is I'll have a patient who could come to me and they'll say, like, I follow a vegan diet or I follow a plant-based diet. That doesn't tell me anything about whether it's a healthy diet, because potato chips are vegan, apple juice is vegan, right? And so defining your diet and good health by what you don't eat, I think, is a lot less useful than defining your diet and its healthfulness based on what you do eat. What's actually going in your mouth? I don't care if you're vegan, Mediterranean, keto, what kind of dietary pattern you follow. It's less about what you avoid and more about what you do eat, because, if you could avoid 50 things in the world that are supposed to be terrible for you, but if you're not eating any vegetables or, you're not eating anything with vitamins, like, your diet's not going to be healthy. And so really focusing on putting good stuff in your mouth rather than being so fearful of being poisoned by something that might not be perfect going in your mouth is, I think, a really healthy, constructive way to look at your diet. I think the third one is the importance of routine. And so, we think about diet as being sort of this main key to health, but I think we also forget that sleep plays a really big role, movement and activity play a really big role. And ultimately, for optimal health, our bodies want us to be in a rhythm of, consistent meal times, adequate rest, regular movement. And when any one of those sort of three pieces of the puzzle are missing, it's going to be really hard to have sort of true and complete health and wellness. And so, we talk a lot about diet, but then, we stay up too late, messing around on YouTube, and then we get 5 hours of sleep. Or, we skip meals some days and then, try to compensate by eating like a super healthy lunch, but we didn't have breakfast. And I think the best way to really be kind to our bodies and sort of give our bodies what they need is to pay attention to consistent rhythms, routines, meal times, sleep times. Our bodies thrive, I think, when we have these set schedules and our organs know what to expect and have that predictability.
Well, Tamara, those were completely excellent. I love all of those. So thank you for that. If someone wanted to learn more about you, learn more about the book, The Bloated Belly Whisperer, where would you like for me to send them?
Well, I have a website, thebloatedbellywhisperer.com, and there's information about the book. I have a lot of my old newsletters where I just kind of sound off on things that are on my mind and important to me. There's links to things that I've written. I write a lot online for US News and for Self, and so links to a lot of those articles are on my website. And so I think my website's a great place to start.
Excellent. Now you can go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/365, and I'll be sure to have a link there. So Tamara, thank you so much for being a part of 40 Plus Fitness.
Thank you for having me. It was so fun.
If you've been struggling with gastrointestinal issues, you know it's a big pain. And now Tamara, in her book, has given you a quiz that's going to help you have the right conversations with your doctor to get this taken care of once and for all. So I do hope that you'll go out and check out that book if you have any issues with your stomach at all. If you're also, I've been telling you this past couple of weeks, during the month of January, I am offering to sell you a signed copy of the Wellness Roadmap. You can go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/hardbound to get a hardbound edition of the book, or you can go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/paperback to get a paperback edition of the book. A signed copy mailed directly to you. I can only do this during the month of January because in February I'm moving to Panama. So hurry up while supplies last, I guess, because I did get a shipment of books in and I'd like to get them in your hands if you're interested in having a signed copy. So go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/hardbound or 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/paperback. Thank you. Next time on the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, we welcome back Audrey Johns and discuss her book, Lose Weight with Your Instapot. Until then, have a happy and healthy week.